Maybe it's time for some of us to stop believing in the gods that we grew up with and come to belief in the God revealed in Jesus, who shows us what it really is like to follow after him. Maybe the reason we begin to question God or question is God good is because the God that we were told about as kids is not the God that actually exists. We were handed a childlike answer, but when adult questions started to happen, our childlike answer began to fall apart. So maybe we just need to walk through the gods we shouldn't believe in to get to the God that does exist. Now, I know many of you have turned to Psalm 103. We're going to get to that in just a second. But right now, what I want to do is I want to talk about 4 gods you shouldn't believe in. But most of us have and still do. Gods that I've wrestled with as well, and gods that we see Jesus begin to tell us there's something different. Here's the first one. The first God you shouldn't believe in, and that is what I want to call the bodyguard God. The bodyguard God, okay? It's tricky. It's the jersey, all right? That's what's throwing me off. I feel this burning on the right side of my body. I don't know what it is. But the bodyguard God is the God that always shows up and saves the day, always protects you and never lets anything bad happen to you. And for many of us, we picked this up as a kid, right? Our parents prayed for us. I'm grateful for that. But we assumed that God would always protect, always take care of, and always make sure everything was okay. And that's great to pray those prayers. And we should pray those prayers. We always are going to pray for our kids to have a safe journey and get there safely and get back safely and be healthy and be blessed and all those kind of things. And there's nothing wrong with that. But what happens when God says no? And something tragic happens in your life, and something tragic happens in your family, and the bodyguard God didn't take the bullet. What happens in those moments? Does that mean that God no longer exists? Does that mean that God is not good? Well, let's just give some context here. If that was the version of God that the church began to talk about 2,000 years ago, they would have never made it out of the first century. And here's why. Because they were a people that kept having bad things happen to them. They were persecuted and they were executed. All of the disciples died horrific deaths, beheaded and stoned and boiled alive and impaled, and just awful things happened to them. And if they were going around saying, believe in our God because nothing bad will happen to you, everybody would have laughed at them. And especially since their leader was somebody who was crucified on a criminal's cross. This was not their message. This was not what they were saying. In fact, Jesus himself said, in this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I've overcome the world. In other words, this version of God that you and I have grown up with, it just isn't the right version. There will be bad things that happen to all of us. And if we think the only God we can believe in is the one that always protects and always takes the bullet for us, guess what? That's not the God we read about in the Bible, and that's not the God we see revealed by Jesus. So if that's your version of God, you should stop believing in that version of God. Here's a second one we should give up on. This is the on-demand God. This is the God that's always at the ready when you need something. Kind of the genie in the bottle, right? And it doesn't even have to be selfish things. It can be things like, God, I need my senior in high school to pass this test, okay? And you might be the senior in high school. God, I need you to help me pass this test. Did I study? No, but I need you to save the day right now, right? And some of these are good prayers. Some of these are selfless prayers. Some of these are, help this person out, take care of this one. And at some point, they don't happen. At some point, something goes wrong, and you've prayed something and asked for a sign, and nothing happened. But I always think about this person we read about in the scriptures. They called him John the Baptizer, or it got shortened to John the Baptist. And John was the cousin of Jesus, and John is older than Jesus, and John is going around telling everybody, prepare the way of the Lord. That's him. He's the Son of God. He's going to save his people from their sins and change the world. And when John gets thrown in prison, he starts to wonder. And he sends one of his followers to Jesus to say, did I get this wrong? How come you haven't busted me out of prison yet? And Jesus says, look at all that's going on. Go tell John that the blind now see and the lame now walk. The prophecies are being fulfilled, even if it didn't fulfill your request. I mean, think about it. This on-demand God, this is basically our way of saying the kind of God that we would be if we were God. I mean, what would you do if you were God? Cowboys would always win, right? I tell you what I'd get rid of, humidity. Done. No more humidity, no more mosquitoes, crickets, we don't need those. All of it gone, right? And you've got a version of God, and I've got a version of God, and it all begins to be kind of projected upon the God, and we think, if you're not that God, then I don't believe in a God, and you must not be good. But Jesus said, listen, that version of God doesn't exist. You should get rid of that idea. I mean, think about it. If I got everything I prayed for when I was 15 or 16 years old, my life would be a disaster. And for some reason, God knows when to say no. Here's a third version of God that you should get rid of, and that is the boyfriend God. Or you can say girlfriend God, but this is basically the God that kind of makes his presence felt all the time. And you know what I mean. It happened when you were at church camp. And you were at camp, and it was a Thursday night, and you were sleep-deprived and coming off a sugar high, but something, man, you just felt the Spirit of God, you know? And it just gave you all the feels. And you went down and dedicated your life to Jesus, and mainly because you were following a girl that went down and did the same thing, you know, but you felt all the feels, you were vibing, everything was great with God. And then you come back, and it hasn't been the same since, and you're wondering what went wrong. Or maybe you come in here on a Sunday and you've had great moments in here before, but now it's kind of like, meh. And then you're looking down the row and somebody's got their hands outstretched during worship and tears rolling down their face. You're like, I guess I got to sit in that seat next time I get here, right? Because something's going on over there that's not happening right here. You expected to always have all the feels when it comes to God. Well, who told you that? I mean, the reality is that many of us go through seasons where we don't feel anything. The great Mother Teresa, who spent her whole life dedicated to serving the poor, after she had passed away, they published her prayer journals. I'm sure that was her intent in writing those. But somebody published them, and in there we read there were months, even years, where she said, God, I don't feel your presence, but I'll continue to serve. In fact, we even see this in the life of Jesus. Even though being God in the flesh, hanging on a cross, cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? There are going to be moments that you just don't feel it, but it doesn't mean he's not there. And if that's the version of God that you continue to think needs to be there, then you're often going to think God isn't good. We should get rid of that version of God. Can I give you one more? This is the toughest one to get rid of. It's the guilt God. This is the God that doesn't want anything good to happen in your life, and if it's enjoyable, the answer is no. Has anything to do with sex? The answer is no, no, no. And it's constantly no, 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 and God doesn't like you. He might actually love you because he's morally obligated, but you just don't feel good about him at all. And there is this tremendous sense of guilt you feel about God. And here's why this is the toughest one for you, because you can't outrun this. Even if you change churches, even if you change gods, you still feel this weight of, I am not good enough. I haven't lived up to his expectations. And as a result, you just feel this complete guilt with God. And I'll say this many times, that you can't out-sin God. God's grace is big enough to get a hold of you, and there's something inside of you that thinks, but you don't know what I've done. And listen, the problem that you have and I have is not that we know what we've done, is that we don't know what he's done for us. And that he has taken the blame for us and died on a cruel cross for our sins. And if you have that version of God that's constantly telling you how guilty you are and how shameful you are, and even though you prayed the prayer and you got baptized and you've come to church and you've turned your life around, you still carry that guilt around with you. That version of God doesn't exist. because Jesus died to take away that guilt so you and I could live free. You need to get rid of that God. You see, for so many of us, we have lived our lives just believing in the wrong God. And a lot of times it came with good intentions. A parent that said, God's always going to take care of you. And there's truth to that. Maybe a Sunday school teacher that said something about God. God's always watching. Don't mess up. Okay, that was probably to get me to sit down and stop talking, but you carry that, right? And a lot of times we carry these childlike answers about God into our adult questions and they don't work. Let me ask you an adult question. Where do babies come from? It depends on who's asking, right? Your 5-year-old? Your 15-year-old? A medical student? Maybe we're living with 5-year-old answers when what we really need is graduate-level answers for our faith. And maybe it's time for some of us to stop believing in the gods that we grew up with and come to belief in the God revealed in Jesus, who shows us what it really is like to follow after him.